Kevin Stein was born in Anderson, Indiana, and educated at IU Bloomington. He's currently the Caterpillar Incorporated Professor of English at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. Right, you've probably heard a zillion times if it plays in Peoria. You're probably tired of hearing that. Where he coordinates the creative writing program. He's currently the Poet Laureate of Illinois and doing a fantastic job. What I admire most about his work as laureate is that he really constructs it as service, going throughout the entire state and reaching as many people as possible with his laureate activities. He's published 11 books of poetry, criticism, and anthology. I'm not going to mention the names of those right now because I want to get to an introduction more particular to his work, but it's on all of the posters that you all have seen and all the material that I've sent you already. He's won many prizes. He's a scholar of the poet James Wright. He's written prolifically on James Wright, and I know that at least half of you in this room know the work of James Wright because I've indoctrinated you. He's such a wonderful poet, so you know some of Kevin's roots right there with James Wright. Yusef Komunyakaa, who's a wonderful poet, has commented beautifully on his work that his work is a tour de force of mercurial wit and quickness, politics and aesthetics. Kevin has done so much for poetry in Illinois and poetry throughout the United States. I wanted to say a few things about his work. We've been reading Sufficiency of the Actual, and I begin by saying, in his poem, In Human Hands, Kevin Stein writes the following: I lived the abyss between reach and grasp, affirming therefrom the necessity of forgiveness. This sense of human compassion, what Stein refers to so beautifully as the necessity of forgiveness, permeates his poetry. What does it mean to forgive? Who forgives and why? What in our culture requires not only forgiveness, but critique? When is it most appropriate to critique? And how might critique even at times be a form of forgiveness? Such questions trouble Stein's work in generative ways. He's a poet of history, of America and the world, as well as a poet of popular culture. He may in one breath literally and metaphorically dig into our cultural past, as he does in a poem titled On Thinking of the Second Time They Shoveled Up Mr. Lincoln, and in another breath address seemingly mundane topics of popular culture, as he does in his poem on reading Prince Valiant in the Sunday comics, or in even more contemporary images of popular culture, as he does in his tremendously inventive poem that I know many in the audience here know, Newscrawl, whose form skillfully replicates the brevity, disjointedness, and timbre of a newscrawl across our television sets. His poems often span the divide between past and present, and in so doing crackle with the energy of a restless mind trying to come to grips with our fast-paced culture, investigating the role of the poet who, as seer, knows the stones of the past, historical and literary, but who is smart enough to understand he needs to lay a new path of compassion and understanding into the present toward the future. His is a humane poetry. One feels upon reading his work that a real person is talking, sharing the complexities of what it means to live a life fully human. In this, Kevin Stein reflects the concerns of one of his greatest loves, the poetry of James Wright. But Stein's work is all its own, never derivative. His poetry says at its core that we are all in this human mess together. Yet we can find solace through a poetry of deep seeing, of deep attention, celebrating together what it means to truly be human. And we are so honored, Kevin, to have you with us today and to actually be able to hear work that many in this room have read on the page, and to experience the gifts that you bring not only nationally, but in particular throughout the state of Illinois, to bring this to your neighboring state here in Indiana. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Stein.
Thanks for coming out. It's a beautiful spring day. Many of us have other things to do other than poetry, so I really appreciate your coming here. I grew up in Anderson, Indiana. The last thing I ever thought about doing was being a poet. I'm the first person from my family to attend university. My family came to America, the German side, the Stein side, in 1848 at the height of the potato famine across Europe. And it was until 1972 till one of us made it to university. I often say this as I travel around Illinois because people have this mistaken conception of what a poet is and how one becomes a poet and what it means and how we behave. And I labor to disabuse people of those notions. It's wonderful to be back in Indiana. The last time I was in Fort Wayne. I was here for the summer between my junior and senior years in college. I drove a summer route for guys on vacation delivering Jewel Tea Osco products. I drove one of those vans all around, not knowing where the hell I was. But the beautiful thing about it, and I do recall this, I recall exactly that I made $2,315. Now, $2,315 supplemented my scholarship, paid my housing, paid my food, bought my beer, a new flannel shirt, which was the 70s style. And it was a great gift to me to have that work. And so, I might add, many of my good college friends came from Fort Wayne. And being a Hoosier, there was a lot of good basketball in Fort Wayne and used to be in Anderson. I usually read a couple of poems by Illinois youth when I get started, and I wasn't going to do that, but I decided I want to read you this really short little poem. And it's part way of thanks to George for all the work that George does as poet laureate, or has done as poet laureate of Indiana and continues to do. He's a vibrant person, a real center around which people want to huddle and want to pick up some of that vibe. And you feel that when you're with him, and it's the purest form of service and spiritual uplift. I gave this assignment, it's a real easy assignment. You go to a 5th grade class and you talked a little bit about what a poet laureate is. You read some kid poems and I'd say, okay, now let's write one. The 3 wildest kids in this class, Eric, Grant, and Cole, 5th grade boys, I could see they were trouble. And so instead of having them alone, I put them together and made them in charge of everything. Suddenly, they were co-opted. And so my prompt was, write about something that you love. And so these guys, Eric, Grant, and Cole, did this. It's a poem titled Bread. Bread, bread, bread. White bread, wheat bread. Stale, soggy, moldy bread. Soft, warm, cold bread. Those are just a few. Raisin bread, crazy bread, blueberry bread, too. Thin bread, thick. Don't forget cornbread. Best of all, I like French toast. The genius of these 3 kids is so obvious in that it's playful, it's smart, and yet it enacts some of the oldest artistic traditions. The first is you set a pattern. Bread, 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 bread. Every artist knows when you set a pattern, what do? You break it. And when you break it, explosions, pyrotechnics, one hopes, and you get a lot of attention. So they did that. Look at the other thing they did. What's this line? Thin bread, thick. I'm not sure what that means, but I love it. I love its mystery. I love its fun of language. I love those strong beats. And then the terrific little gesture. Don't forget cornbread. So it reaches out of the poem and grabs you by the chin, you reader, and says, we're a part of this together. That direct address, one of the oldest gestures of poetic art. So it's an exciting little poem for me, and it was the delight out of these guys. And I wrote about this poem in a chapter in my book, Poetry's Afterlife, on youth poetry. I had to get their parents' permissions to print this poem, and the funny thing about it is, each of their parents asked me the same question independently, and it was, is that really a poem? And I said, sure, it sure is. And then proceeded to tell them how and why, and I don't know if I persuaded them. But that gives you an idea of the kind of pleasurable surprise and almost a sense of instruction that I get. When I go back to my own work, I think of thin bread thick. How can I do that? Most writers read only to steal, right? If you're honest. You know, you read for pleasure. You read to steal because you want to figure out how others are doing this. If you're a basketball player and the guy does the same crossover dribble 3 times in a row and takes it to the hoop on you, number one, 4th time they're not doing that. The next thing you're doing is you're going home at night and you're practicing your crossover dribble. That's how art works. So I try to steal from anybody I can, and any kind of art, painting, music, sculpture. I call it aesthetic kleptomania. A friend of mine goaded me one time to write about this topic, and it's when my family and I were chosen as a Nielsen rating family, and my family didn't want to do it. And I said, sure, we'd be glad to do it, and we did. And what happens is when you get to the end of that whole process, you realize that you have written down every show they ever watched on any of your TVs for 7 days a week for 24 hours, and it's a portrait of you and your family, sometimes a disarming portrait. So this is on being a Nielsen family. We pocket 5 ones when we agree. Fingered cash, our soul's ransom. And a family viewership record book for each TV, of which we've 3. We are the postmodern Descartes, pledging, I watch, therefore I am. We're the grand experiment that was America, both scientist and the mouse, with a human ear stitched to its pink back, checking the appropriate idiot boxes. We're our own peeping Tom, peering in. On stage, we're culture's disguise, the way a bickering couple makes nice when the bell ding-dongs neighbors in for cocktails and unsalted cheese nips. Though we watch Oprah, we circle BBC News. Though it's Jerry Springer, we mark Charlie Rose. No, not South Park, not Cops, not World's Funniest Animal Videos, but History Channel and Discovery, NASA Live, Nightline, and devotionals. The Food Network's Thanksgiving Day vegan special. We are watching ourselves watched. We are never enough. So the lie is as we wish to be. Oh, thank you. I had the great pleasure. I had a chance to be on the What Do You Know show. And I read that poem or recited that poem, and I had a great experience, just a great time. And afterwards, I'm glad I didn't know this. The host said, well, 750,000 people just heard that poem. And I'm glad I hadn't pondered that ahead of time. I am a history buff, and I'm interested in history. I like to make things, and I like the idea of those who like to make things. I'm a pretty good carpenter, not a very good plumber. I can wire a little bit. I'm a good finish carpenter. I like to make stuff. I plant things. I like planting beds. I like to take nothing or something and make something else of something. Here's an example of an assignment I gave students in my class, and I sat down and wrote the poem with them. I said, write about something you wish you had invented. And so this is it. It's titled Blue Tuesday. I want to invent a thing as beautiful and useless as the slinky. Because it's Blue Tuesday, second Tuesday of February, a tradition invented by my mother, who's fond of puzzlers. Say, did the first inventor invent the notion of new and improved? Or, given a philosophical trees falling in unpeopled woods, was there sound? Class dismissed. Because it's Blue Tuesday, I want to be Richard James and wife Betty, all pumps and pearls. Tinkering a machine to harness ship's horsepower when plink, a spring skitters out and walks down the laboratory's metal steps. Aha, they burped over meatloaf lunch. Indigestion, the mother of invention. The slinky's pure sprung pleasure. It doesn't feed, nor clothe, nor house the poor, but it won't put your eye out either. I have, in a fit of wayward fatherliness, spent afternoons walking a slinky up the stairs so my daughter could walk it back down again. Good boy. The slinky's inventor invented this, too. A game to be played by willing surrogates like you and me. Not unlike pilot Charles Sweeney, who delivered Oppenheimer's invention to Nagasaki. Fat Man, the first bomb he ever dropped. That was 1945. Same year the slinky was invented. If a plane drops a bomb that no one hears, and afterwards there's no one left, did it happen? I, too, have ridden the moral high horse, fingering Sweeney even more than Tibbets, who banked over Hiroshima, not knowing what mushroom would sprout. Sweeney knew, and never the sour apple of regret. He didn't sing the blues, though both the blues and the not are original American art forms. The way I want becomes the blues when the chorus answers, you can't have it. Sweeney, because it's Blue Tuesday, second Tuesday of the second month, coldest but shortest metaphor of the human. I wish I'd invented the slinky. I wish you and I were beautiful and useless together, dropping a big, fat slinky from the blue sky of never happens. Thank you, thank you. You don't need to clap. That's very kind of you, and I appreciate that. But you don't have to do that. I want to read a poem a little bit about my factory life. I worked 2 summers at Container Corporation of Indiana, or Container Corporation of America in Anderson, Indiana, and that also supplemented my college scholarship and got me through school. And those men and women that I worked with, instead of making fun of the fancy pants poet, actually encouraged me. And I said, if I ever got a chance, I was going to do two things. If I ever got a chance to be a poet, I was going to write a poem, or more than one poem, about that experience, and that I was going to give a poetry reading in a factory. And I've done that a few times. I've read in factories. And I feel like I've repaid a debt to some of those folks who supported the geeky me. There's a poet mentioned in here, and it's Rilke, the great lyric poet. It steals a line from, or mentions a line from perhaps his most famous poem, The Archaic Torso of Apollo. I'll show you something. The poem, okay, you're not going to hear this. The poem looks like this. It's got a crack down the middle of it. It's a form that I stole from the Greek poet C.V. Kavafy. Kavafy did it because in Greek quantitative meter, they have sustained vowels, and those sustaining vowels require a pause. And so the form just interested me for English. What could I do with that in English? And so I've written a few poems in this form. One of the great things, you poets, one of the things, great things about this line is you get 2 line breaks per line. It's called The Afterlife. And I'm reading this poem. I've never read this poem at a reading, and I've chosen several poems I haven't read before. For you. The Afterlife. As a priest marries the church, so I wed work. The union's tin ring, a fin per week and nothing down. Trouble was, everything was down. The line, my pay, the pickup's windows in rain. The blonde in shipping couldn't keep lunch down or her pants up. Damp her sloppy tears, damp the shirt's pits, damp the Chevy's back seat where rum and cokes broke the ice. Her lesson: never operate heavy machinery with lips and zipper. My hands made feral love to chill metal, work song of parts I'd never see whole. So boys, smoke 'em if you've got 'em. Smokes made ash, the dust from which ye came, and to dust ye shall. Dust upon the riven garden, dust at neck and sleeves of my black pocket tee, dust etching each night's second shower, my chest, the archaic torso of unionized Apollo. School's velvet Rilke counseled me, you must change your life. Though I wished his face so near, I could punch it. Language I understood, I could not understand, changed me for the price of student loans in Latin. I'm living the afterlife. These hands uncalloused, tweed hound's-toothed, my dust become the stuff of stacked books. I'm living the afterlife for those who cut, then polish, lug and heave, who stack mortise and miter, swing shift. They don't need my guilt or your pity. Change is what's fisted back from our broken dollar. Change is stashed by the back door in a cracked ball jar. I'm going to read a poem that was from Wrestling Lee Poe for the Remote. It's a book basically in which I engage Lee Poe and take Lee Poe on, and I don't know how that happened, but it did, and I felt like Lee Poe was there arguing with me, telling me what I was doing wrong, and stop writing about factories, write more about climbing and wine, and so we went back and forth. In sufficiency, I want to read a poem titled Natural Selection. It quotes the Harvard scholar E.O. Wilson, and E.O. Wilson was made famous by his study of ants. But it's basically about what reminds me our current political climate and all the coarse language going back and forth. You know those words you can't say in public? And when you do say them, you feel really good and really crappy all at once. That's what this poem is about in the beginning. All poems start one place and hopefully get another. Right? Natural selection. Saying some words makes us feel dirty but powerful. So we survive and multiply. Words to boast or threaten, to inflame or to belittle. Belittle, both metaphor and low blow. Words pubescent slumber party giggle, then quick do each other's hair. Do itself a verb to make girls blush. Words boys strut across the stage of adolescent Greek theater, conjuring their father's tragic swagger. Words women spout when phoning the divorce lawyer, or whisper while ogling the leather-chapped hard hat stud erecting the ladies' room door. That circus big top of adjectives. Now's the time to say these words silently to yourself. Saying them makes us feel powerful but dirty. Culture helpless against the gold rush of natural selection. Calling it Darwinism, claims E.O. Wilson, is a rhetorical device to make evolution seem not fact, but mere faith, like Maoism. Repeat that silently to yourself. Me, I'd thought to say them out loud. These words totemic as the testosterone they unleash. You wanted to hear them spoken as the word was made flesh. These, the father of spear and hunt and lust. These, the proud daddy of our H-bomb and their videotaped beheadings. These words make reason shudder as if before a god. I'm going to read another poem with a little political commentary in it. And it's a poem about that right around the time that President Obama was elected, I noticed a lot of pundits saying, okay, good, it's all over now. All that racial disharmony, it's all gone. We all hoped, but being human, we knew likely what would happen. And sometimes, the things that make you want to write a poem are things that ennoble you and uplift you and bedazzle you. And sometimes the things that make you want to write a poem are things that you want to investigate, that you don't understand. And sometimes the things that make you want to write a poem are things that tick you off. And sometimes it's all of those things together. And this is beautiful. Is beautiful. Black is the new blonde. So everyone wants a piece in these halcyon days when politics makes oh so hot what heretofore had borne the mark of Cain. Or at least sufficient cause to get one's head clubbed by a jowly southern sheriff chewing tobacco once harvested by a wagon load of slaves. No more get to the back of the bus, boy. No more boy. Black is the new blonde. Now septuagenarian Larry King smugly proclaims his young son yearns to be black, announcement to crystallize the social leap from racism right through the color blindness we never attained, to an elevated plateau where black smacks cool. All's better now. No more dumb blonde jokes. Tell me, how many blondes does it take to screw a low-watt light bulb? No more. A priest, a rabbi, and a black guy walked into a bar. Jokes that flashed a match of stifled laughter as well as guilt easily blown out. Right index pantomiming, no, 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 in the smoky white air. Black is the new blonde. When Alfonso Toss secret knocked me through the Soul Hole's 1974 door, I was neither black nor blonde. Roosevelt Johnson and his 7 C's milked a wet silk blue set. Black faces in tidal sway. Eyeing me, the collective 7 C's stilled mid-howl because I is white. Brothers, Alfonso lilted, this cat's with me. So Roosevelt unfurled his stalled growl, while a stand-up bass cleaned what muddy break our skin had wrought. The answer's 3 blondes, 1 to screw and 1 to brush her shoulder-length hair. What would Emmett Till think of Larry's white tots pining for an afro? Emmett not so breezily swinging from that crooked tree. What Medgar, Martin, and Clayton, my knifed dead friend? Has Jackie Robinson slid home safe at last? Citizens, we want so badly what we want to believe. Clink, clink. No more shines, the robed choir sings. No more Sambo, while history's solo, unswayed amidst all this swaying, whistles Dixie. Okay. I'm going to read a happy poem, because I purposely read some poems that are a little unhappy and angry and are for us. This poem is a poem that I stole the title from James Wright. And James Wright was a preternaturally unhappy guy, manic depressive guy, so he's going back and forth between despair and ecstasy, like many of us, and probably more often than once in a day. And so what I wanted to do was to write a poem that sort of embodied and enacted that wackiness and that giddiness. And so this is Today I Was Happy, so I made this poem. Death's not the most depressing thing to write about, but writing about it is. Incessantly fretting, you'll hammer a thumb, trebles the hurt of actually doing it. Kids doing jumping jacks are named Jack only when they are. The Lincoln penny costs more to make than it's worth. Adopting the cop dog shot in a drug bust gives his paws pause. The nuthatch walks head down a tree trunk, but not walking back up. Jumping's what they're doing only in the figurative sense. Your bedroom's dresser doesn't actually dress you, but cherry's a nice accent. Walking head down back up the trunk would be backing up. Death depends upon what the definition of is. Montezuma's Blue Cloud Cafe sold my books, if sold means free stains. Each year, 13 billion pennies are minted, but not of mint. Copper's what the bad guys grunted when busted. The definition of is preceded that of was. Was necessitated Samuel Johnson's inventing the dictionary. Johnson invented the white fro mullet for Reynolds' portrait. Incessantly fretting, you'll hammer a thumb, troubles the hurt of actually doing it. I said that before, really means you're not listening. The drug dog's licking his yard, a peace sign of yellowed grass is good. Detritus has us in it, and that's no joke. There's no free lunch now that magazine's gone under. Newsweek's yearly list of who's gone under is less depressing when read upside down. Not a single title in the Norton Anthology of Postmodern Poetry begins with the word death. Andrew Marvell's writing about dying made his coy mistress horny. Nothing begins with death. The title, Today I Was Happy, So I Made This Poem, was lifted from James Wright with permission of the nuthatch head down. The rescued dog named I Heard a Fly Buzz, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is called Happy. Thank you. I'll take some questions when you get a chance. Thank you. Okay, somebody has to find his or her voice and ask the question.
And please do. I mean, this is an opportunity to ask whatever you like.
No bad questions. I quit early, so you could ask me questions here. Yes, sir.
That last poem you just read, I'm a physician, so I have a little bit of experience with psychology and psychiatry. But that poem you just read is the perfect description of a bipolar person. Mm-hmm. It's just without comparison.
Yeah, isn't that
it was mind blower.
That's interesting from a physician standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I used to have patients like that.
Yeah.
Jump from one thing to another, make no sense at all, and I'm just sitting there just, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
That's all you can do.
Now we know what our physicians think. Okay, whatever.
You know, for me, that poem was so much fun to write because here, the trick of it is you say a thing and then something you say in there, you twist it. And then you connect it to the next line and you twist it again. And, you know, if you teach, it's not hard to teach some kinds of creativity, which is really just imagine of play. Be willing to play and be stupid, to make a mistake. And so in that poem, I'm reading it and I'm thinking, damn, this goes on too long, doesn't it? But I loved each one of those jokes, and I cut off about that much before it was published. But it enacted both of those things, this happiness and despair, and happiness, despair. And I wanted it to end on happy, and so that's why I renamed the dog. And I'm glad you're here. Is it Ginger? Ginger. Yeah, I have a poem in Wrestlingly Poe that was written by my Labrador Lily. Only she didn't really write it, but she sat at my feet, of course, all the time that I was writing and crumpling pages and complaining. And so she speaks the poem. It's a pretty damn good poem. Okay, what other questions do you have? Yeah.
I was gonna ask you this later tonight in class, but some of your forms, like Upon the Porch Swings Time Machine, which is in Sufficiency of the Actual, and even News Crawl, did those, like, the form of those poems come in the first draft, or did that happen in the later draft? I know that some of my forms, my brilliant forms, can happen in the first draft, but sometimes it's when I'm revising that that brilliance kind of just happens.
Yeah, you know, I think that's right. Emerson said something really smart. Emerson said a lot of things really smart, and one of those things was that a poem should have an architecture like a plant or an animal. And by that, he was arguing for why free verse or organic verse was better than to-tum, 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 to blue, to-tum, 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 to you. This was his argument because he was trying to argue for an American aesthetic against European or particularly British aesthetic. A lot of time, I always write in pencil and I always write on scrap paper. So that I don't feel like I'm wasting anything. You know, these are handouts that I have left from my students, or I write on the backs of envelopes. It's pretty bad, actually. And most of the time, I don't have a form in mind. I want to write as quickly as I can. I don't want to worry about spacing. I don't want to worry about alignment. But sometimes about halfway through, I start doing that stuff. And that particular poem, I like a poem with air between the lines. And that's particularly important when you're asking your reader to follow you on really hard leaps between things. You know, a lot of poets are just so arrogant, they figure, I don't care if the reader gets it. This makes me brilliant if the reader doesn't get it. Well, no, it makes you stupid. You know, you're the stupid one, not the reader. And so for me, I like to find forms that fit that individual poem, and in this particular poem, Upon the Porch Swing, I guess in the end I kind of thought it was like the porch swing kind of thing, and it's many poets have dealt with that, but William Carlos Williams, in the great American modern poet, did so much with that with his triadic line. That way each little phrase, and there's white space above it and below it. Now that means that better be a pretty good phrase, right? Because if there's slack language in there, the reader sees it. But that's kind of the most exciting thing for me. And many times I'll have poems, they'll go through 5, 6, 8, 10 different forms. I mean, of course, tens of drafts. But it could go from a prose poem to a poem that looks like that to a poem that's in stanzas. I like architecture. You know, I like arrange and stuff. Literary feng shui, you know, poetic feng shui. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
How do you decide when a poem is done, and you can abandon it, or if you save it back for another day?
That's the hardest thing, isn't it, George? I'm never sure when my poems are done. Sometimes there's a satisfaction that one has with them, and it just feels right. Auden, W.H. Auden, the poet Auden, said, a poem should click shut like a box. that's one kind of form of a poem, and his poems many times did click shut like a box. I kind of like my poems to open like a box, you know? That's just, we're different guys here. There's that famous point, a poet that repeats this over and over again: a poem is never really finished, it's merely abandoned. Yeah, I sometimes will depend upon other readers, and I have poet friends that I send my work to. My wife hears everything. Poor woman, she hears everything. She's really good, and she's honest. That slack line, that bores me. Those 3 lines in there, I was snoozing. Wow, you know, I love her for saying she's the sweetest person in the world, that I want honesty from her. So sometimes it's that way. Sometimes there's just this satisfaction, and it's something you can't put your hand on. When you look at the flower garden, and you know, the low blooming stuff is all in bloom, and the mid blooming stuff is all in bloom, and oh my God, the cone flowers have just come on. You know you've made this thing and it's right. Sometimes poems are like that. So a lot of times it's for me to the ear. Does it sound right? Other times it's I'm all wrong because I quit the poem too soon. And you know what I really was trying to say, I didn't put in the poem because I was scared or whatever. So that's a difficult and arduous process, and I don't have the answer to that. Yeah, I don't, and it changes for every poem. But I would say that 60% of the time there was this feeling of inarticulate satisfaction, and that's about it. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank God for the good weather.
Indeed.
Oh yeah, loud.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. And the conference call was terrific. That was some of the most exciting. You know, I just said, well, I don't want to not talk. They spent all this time reading my book. I don't know very many people that have read. You don't get a chance to meet people who have read your work. So yeah, thank you.
People in the audience don't know that Kevin's visiting writers visit was snowed out last year.
Yeah.
It has the distinction of being the only event in all the years I've done, more than 20 years, the series that was snowed out. And so it's particularly fitting that we have such a beautiful day today. But Steve, go ahead.
It's true.
Well,
Yes.
it's kind of on the same line as Paige's question is about like the form in this. This is like, if anybody should teach form, it should be out of this book.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
But my question is, how do you stay so attentive to what all is going on in the poem in the writing process? Like the form and then the syntax, I mean everything. I mean, you know, I have trouble, like I'll excel in one thing but then falter in another way, you know, and I just collectively having the mindset to get where I need to get to, I lack in that. And how do you?
Well, I think all of us were nodding our heads that we feel the same way. We feel we falter, and for me, I resign myself that it's going to be many stages and many steps. You got to be a tinkerer. You got to love tinkering, so that the poem's going to go through a lot of drafts till it gets there. We all begin a poem thinking, pretty soon this is going to be infused with the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. All I have to do is speak it. Yeah, all I have to do is speak it. And then, gradually, you realize, So in first drafts, something really hard for me. It should be easier now after all these years, but just not hating every word I write. Just going on. William Stafford had, he said, you feel like you're writing bad poems, you feel like you have writer's block. Bill Stafford would say, well, just lower your standards. And he's funny, and that's funny, but it's true. And when you don't fret it so much, imagination comes from nowhere. And so I just kind of trust the poem that I'm not going to get it just right, but I want to see where I'm going. So I'm a hiker. My wife and I are hikers, and it's so hard for me to not want to get to the end of the hike. So a 7-hour hike down and up. My wife is totally in the moment. I'm thinking, I can't get to the top. I've got to get to the top of French Pass. And I take a breath and say, no, it's the getting to the top of French Pass. And so for me, that whole process, just what happens. Secondly, I liken it to taking a comb through hair, and just you take out the knots, you take out the tangles, and until it feels smooth, till it looks good, till it sounds right. I read all my poems out loud all the time, even in writing them. And I built a separate little office away from my house because I'd hear my kids playing, and I wanted to be playing with my kids. And secondly, they'd hear me and they'd say, well, what are you doing, Dad? What are you talking about? Who are you talking to? And I'm talking to me. So I really spent a lot of time just going back over. And what that means is having the courage to say, okay, the verb fell. It worked the first time around, but fell is not the right verb. It's not the most pungent verb. Does it have the best sound? Sound is so important to me. And so that's the third thing. When I don't know where I'm going to go, when I don't know what I know, I just make sound. And so I chime words together, and then odd things happen. Because when you're not worried about making sense, language makes sense for you. And language takes you places you didn't know where you were going to go. And so there's a great Hugo example, isn't there, George, where he's writing a poem and he doesn't know where to go, and it's about a waterfall, and he gets to the word cascade, and he doesn't know where to go after cascade, and he starts playing with language, and he comes up with the word suicide, which rhymes or off rhymes with cascade, and then the poem opened up for him. And so I do that as I go through, and it's a process, and you kind of have to enjoy that. Maybe 1 or 2 poems out of 10, can be birthed wholly, a few things change. But for me, most of it is just enjoying sitting back down and, moving the pot, of flowers over this way, and then, moving that down. No. That's kind of, and so there are 2 versions of that. B1, not easily satisfied, and B1 easily satisfied. So you want to not give up, but at some point you have to just say, I don't know what's good about thin bread thick. That's not my line, but I love it, And so sometimes you got to be hard on yourself, and other times you got to know when to be easy. That didn't help either, did it? But it's the conflicted life of an artist. I really do think it's a conflicted life of the artist.
So basically, hearing the musicality in the moment.
Yeah. Look, I'm not aware what my poems are doing. I reread Sufficiency this morning. I don't reread. Do you read your work? People say, "Oh, what you did in line 12." Oh God, which book is that in? What's the title? What's the title of that poem? Because I want to be looking ahead, looking forward. And I thought somebody else had written many of those poems. I mean, I couldn't remember the gesture. I couldn't remember, but what I thought this morning was, okay, this music, that's where you got stuck and you just made those pretty sounds. And then other times I would say, oh, you went back in there, Kevin, and you put those 2 words together because they chimed, and that was a conscious thing. But they seemed written by somebody else. I don't know how to describe that otherwise. And so while you're in the midst of it, you have to be aware and, not handcuffed by the process. Give yourself goodwill and play. Be willing to make a mistake. Poems that, risk. Safe poems, safe art in general is boring art. And so, you either risk language, or you risk subject matter, or you risk insulting this group or that group, or you risk being too pretty and prissy or whatever. But you better have a risk in mind. And for me, most of the times, it's the risk that underlies the poem. I don't know what the poem's going to be about. I start somewhere, just kind of play around, and at some point, that's the weirdest part of it. It's the most intoxicating thing, better than any drug that I've experienced. Now, maybe you guys have experienced others. It is just terrific. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Other than James Wright, who do you return to? Like, which poets are home?
Oh, that's a really good question. It changes all the time. And my top 10 list changes all the time. And you know how it is, you pull out to your phone, it used to be your iPod or whatever, and well, you'd go buy an album and you'd come home and open that album and you'd play it and play it and play it and play it, and then after about 5 weeks, you couldn't stand it anymore, right? And you think the music has changed, but no, the music hasn't changed. You have. And so for me, I find the same thing. I go back to poets, and sometimes those poets don't move me anymore. But the poets that have done the most for me as American poets, William Carlos Williams, Frank O'Hara, James Wright, Philip Levine, poets who have meant a lot to me, kind of trying to figure out what it is to be a male writing poems and what it's like to be a working class guy, Wright and Philip Levine really were useful for me there. I read a lot of my contemporaries, Tony Hoagland, Bob Hickok, Dean Young, Becky and Fritz Goldberg. But you should read widely and much. And here's the other thing I would tell you, don't just read poets. I read the newspaper, read the police beat, because you cannot believe what we do to each other as human beings. And you read the police beat and you see that. Secondly, read people that you don't like, you don't agree with. Because you learn nothing from those you agree with. You need to be challenged. You need to have that nausea in your stomach. And then sometimes you go, well, okay, that's wrong, but yeah, okay. That's really useful to me. So more and more, and I had this conversation with the poet Bob Hickok, who's a terrifically original poet. I don't know how his mind works. But he had said to me, well, when you get a literary journal with your poem in it, and I said, but Bob, what do you do with those? Do you read everybody else's work? And Bob whispered, he said, no, don't tell anybody. And, it's at some point as a writer, your horizon's narrow in your reading. I don't think it's a good thing, but I think it's what happens as we age. For young writers, just read anything and everything, philosophy, art, news, criticism, read just a few of those comments, like on a Yahoo thing, just so you know how horrid we are as human beings, right? And then all of that is part of the mix. I read a lot of philosophy. I just read stuff that challenges me. Sports Illustrated. I read Sports Illustrated, and I wrote an essay on James Wright that was published in American Poetry Review and was one of my critical books, in which I had about a 2-page section in which I quoted from Sports Illustrated. That makes me so happy. The only literary essay ever to quote Sports Illustrated. So I'm an eclectic reader, and I think you should be too, because that's all I know for myself. Anything else? Once going, once, twice. All right, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.